When we look at the map, it's easy to fall for the illusion that the Belt and Road Initiative is mainly about China, Europe, and big corridors across Central Asia. But if we move our eyes a bit further to the southwest, we see something just as important. The entire Middle East and Africa have become a testing ground for Chinese ambitions. Take Ethiopia, a country that for decades was a synonym for poverty and hunger. Today, Chinese trains run there. The railway line from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, built by the Chinese, is the first fully electric railway in Africa. It's used to transport goods to the port of Djibouti, a port that also came into being thanks to Chinese money, and where, interestingly, China's first overseas military base is located. Move further, Mozambique. Here the Chinese are building bridges and roads that link the coast of the Indian Ocean with the country's interior. Every bridge is not just engineering, but politics, because behind the loans come agreements on resource extraction. Kenya, the symbol of a new Africa. The standard gauge railway from Nairobi to Mombasa, modern and fast, built and operated by Chinese consortia. For Kenyans, it's a source of pride. For critics, proof of a new dependency on Beijing, because debt to China is growing faster than GDP. Uganda, more railway lines, infrastructure contracts, and in the background loans that weigh on the state budget for decades. And on the western side of the continent, Ghana. A country that was the Gold Coast already in colonial times, is once again attracting attention. Only now, instead of British trading companies, it's Chinese corporations that are arriving. Gold mines are passing into the hands of investors from Beijing. It's not just business. It's access to one of the most strategic resources in the world. And here a natural connection appears with the Middle East. Because China's presence in Africa is not an end in itself. It's part of a bigger puzzle. Goods from Ethiopia and Kenya go to Djibouti, from there across the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt. Gold from Ghana can end up in Dubai, because the Emirates have become the world's center of gold trade. And oil and gas from the Middle East go to Africa, where Chinese companies are building power plants and refineries. In practice, this means that the Middle East and Africa form one zone of Chinese strategy. The Chinese know they cannot control trade routes without controlling ports in Africa and the Gulf of Aden. That's why they invest in Djibouti. That's why they enter Egypt. That's why they dream about Eilat. For them, the Red Sea is not just geography. It's an artery through which their future flows. And this is where we see the biggest paradox. African states greet Chinese investments like a gift from heaven. The Middle East treats them with suspicion, because every dollar from Beijing means friction with Washington. And yet both sides are part of the same game. The container that starts its journey from Addis Ababa to Djibouti sometimes ends it in Haifa or Ashdod. Gold from Ghana gleams in Dubai, and Chinese trains in Kenya are the same puzzle piece as Chinese cranes in Haifa. This is what the real Belt and Road map looks like. Not just lines on paper. Living arteries that wrap around Africa and the Middle East, tying them into one organism. And that's why, if we want to understand the role of Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates in this story, we also have to look at Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Accra. Because in the 21st century, globalization doesn't recognize borders. And Chinese strategy doesn't distinguish between desert and jungle, Israel or Ghana. The only thing that matters is who controls the route. If we want to understand how the Belt and Road Initiative works, it's not enough to look at maps in Beijing offices or huge port projects in Haifa or Dubai. We have to go deeper to where Africa meets the Middle East, to places that at first glance seem distant, exotic, insignificant. Because it's precisely there, on the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia and Djibouti, that the Chinese built one of their most symbolic projects. Ethiopia, a vast mountainous country full of contrasts. For many people in the world, it's still associated with images of hunger and poverty that flooded TV screens in the 1980s. Those dramatic photos of children with sunken cheeks became icons of suffering and Africa's weakness. But today, reality looks different. Addis Ababa, the capital, is bursting at the seams. Streets are full of cars, new housing estates are rising, skyscrapers are growing. This is no longer the Ethiopia of Haile Selassie or Mengistu. It is a country trying to enter the 21st century. And it is precisely here that China decided to arrive with its biggest export product, infrastructure. Addis Ababa was linked by a modern railway line with the port of Djibouti on the Red Sea. That's 759 kilometers of tracks, hundreds of bridges and tunnels, thousands of Chinese engineers and workers. For Africa, a historic moment. It's the first modern, fully electric railway line on the continent. Imagine a freight train leaving mountainous Ethiopia. Wagon after wagon, containers filled with coffee. Ethiopia is the homeland of coffee, and alongside industrial goods, grain, minerals. After a dozen or so hours of travel through wastelands, mountains, and valleys, the train reaches the port of Djibouti. There, containers are loaded onto ships that sail through the Gulf of Aden, then the Red Sea, passing Yemen and Saudi Arabia, reaching the Suez Canal. From there, straight to Europe. This is not just a railway, it's an artery that links Africa with the Middle East and Europe. A new trade route that fits perfectly into Beijing's vision. Because in the Belt and Road plans, there is no room for blank spots. The Chinese know that if they truly want to control global trade, they need footholds on every continent. And so Ethiopia and Djibouti have become elements of a larger puzzle. For Ethiopia, the railway is a symbol of modernization. For Djibouti, a path to becoming Africa's gateway. And for China, it's more than business. It's also politics and military strategy. Next to the port of Djibouti, which handles goods from Ethiopia, the first foreign base of the People's Liberation Army was built. Few people talk about it, but it's a historic fact. China, which for decades was a closed, shy actor on the global stage, took its first step here as a military power beyond its own borders. The base in Djibouti is not large compared to American installations in the Gulf or NATO ports in Europe. But its significance is enormous. It lies a few kilometers from the entrance to the Red Sea, where ships sail into Bab el-Mandeb, one of the narrowest straits in the world. It's a choke point through which billions of dollars in goods flow. Oil from the Gulf, gas from Qatar, goods from Asia. Whoever controls Djibouti has a hand on the pulse of global trade. The Chinese didn't shout about this. Officially, the base is a logistics point, a place where ships can dock during anti-piracy missions in the Indian Ocean. But anyone who understands geopolitics knows it's only the beginning. A test. Whether China is able to maintain, expand, and integrate its own network of bases around the world. And here we return to the Middle East. Because Djibouti is not an accident. It looks out toward Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Chinese investments in Ethiopia and Djibouti are not just aid for Africa. They are a step towards controlling the entire Red Sea, and thus the trade between the Middle East and Europe. Ethiopia, proud as it is, has become tightly bound to China. Railways, roads, factories, all built thanks to Chinese loans. Critics talk about a new form of colonialism. Instead of cannons and tanks, there are loans and contracts. Instead of the flags of colonial powers, there are logos of Chinese construction firms. But for Ethiopians, this railway is a real change. Goods that used to travel by truck over potholed roads for several days now reach the port in a dozen or so hours. You feel the difference in shop prices, in product availability, in the whole economy. Djibouti, a tiny state that until recently was known only to sailors and traders, is now one of the most important geostrategic points in the world. Not only the Chinese are there, also Americans, French, Japanese. It's the only place on Earth where all these powers have bases side by side. A geopolitical cauldron that's constantly boiling. And in that cauldron, the Chinese are learning what global rivalry looks like. Because Djibouti is more than a base and railway. It's a training ground where the interests of great powers collide. Every ship leaving this port is watched. Every cable that goes underwater is monitored. Every investment is tied to politics. This shows how the Belt and Road Initiative really works. It's not about railway lines, bridges, or factories alone. It's about creating a network. An economic, political, and military network. And Ethiopia and Djibouti are one of the first nodes of that network in Africa. For the Middle East, this has one crucial consequence. Goods from Ethiopia and from deeper inside Africa do not sail to Asia, but to ports that serve the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, the Suez Canal, through which a large part of world trade passes. Dubai, which is becoming a hub for gold, coffee, and raw materials. That's why, when we talk about Israel and China, we cannot ignore Africa. Because the train from Addis Ababa to Djibouti is not just an African project, it's part of the same game in which the port of Haifa, the Suez Canal, and the base in Djibouti are pieces of one puzzle. Ethiopia got a railway, Djibouti got a port and a base, and China got something far more valuable, a foothold that opens doors to the Middle East and Africa at the same time. And this is only the beginning of the story. When we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, the easiest way to present it is on a map, red lines, arrows, ports, and railways. But the real picture of this strategy appears only on the ground, where trains actually run, bridges link shores, and loans turn into burdens for whole generations. And that's exactly the kind of story we see in Kenya, Uganda, and Mozambique, 3 countries that have become a laboratory for Chinese ambitions in Africa. Let's start with Kenya. Nairobi, the capital, is a city full of energy, growing at breakneck speed, crowded, modern, and chaotic at the same time. A few years ago, Kenya proudly announced the launch of the Standard Gauge Railway, a line connecting Nairobi with Mombasa, the country's largest port on the Indian Ocean. For Kenyans, it was a historic moment. The first modern railway since colonial times, the first fast train meant to link the country's interior with the world. The train set off, and Kenyans simply called it SGR. It instantly became a symbol of modernization. The Chinese poured huge resources into it. The railway was built by firms from Beijing. Financing came mainly from Exim Bank loans. At the opening, Chinese and Kenyan politicians shook hands and spoke of friendship for centuries. The train was fast, modern, comfortable. People took selfies in the carriages, and the media showed colorful images like from a travel brochure. But after just a few years, questions began to appear. The cost of building the line exceeded $3 billion, an enormous sum for the Kenyan economy. The loan had to be repaid, and ticket and freight revenues didn't cover even a fraction of that amount. The train is a national pride and a millstone around the neck at once, a symbol of modernity and proof of how expensive Chinese friendship can be. Protests broke out in Kenya. Journalists asked whether the country had sold its future. The opposition spoke of a ghost railway that carries more tourists than freight. And yet no one wanted to give up the investment, because SGR is not just a line. It's a calling card, a sign that Kenya can do it too. A few hundred kilometers to the north in Uganda, the story is similar. There too, the Chinese promised railways, a connection between Kampala and ports on Lake Victoria, and from there to the Indian Ocean coast. Projects were announced with pomp, loans signed in Beijing. But reality turned out harsher. Costs went up, the country's debt approached breaking point, and many investments stalled halfway. Dramatic headlines appeared in the Ugandan press. Will China take our port if we don't pay the debt? The government denied it. Beijing remained silent, but the fear stayed. For ordinary Ugandans, Chinese presence is not abstract. It's the sight of Chinese engineers and workers in small towns. It's new roads and bridges that shorten journeys, but also rising prices, higher taxes, and the awareness that the state is shouldering more and more debt. And then there's Mozambique, a country that for decades sat on the sidelines of global politics, scarred by civil war and poverty. Suddenly the Chinese arrive, building bridges, roads, and power plants. The most spectacular project is the Maputo-Katembe Bridge, the longest suspension bridge in Africa. Spanning the Bay of Maputo, it looks like something from another world. For the people of Mozambique's capital, it's a symbol that their country is finally entering the 21st century. But here too, the story has a darker side. The bridge cost more than $700 million. The loan, of course, came from China's Exim Bank. The press began to ask who and how would pay it back. The bridge is beautiful, but traffic is much lower than planned. People drive across it, but not enough to make the investment profitable. All these stories, Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, share a common thread: modernization that truly changes people's lives, and loans that burden entire states. On one hand, new trains, bridges, and roads. On the other, The fear that if something goes wrong, the Chinese will demand collateral. And in Africa, collateral is not mortgages or factories, but land, ports, and natural resources. And this is where the connection with the Middle East appears. Because all these projects, the railway in Kenya, the lines in Uganda, the bridges in Mozambique, do not exist in a vacuum. Their goal is trade. Goods transported on these lines go to ports on the Indian Ocean coast, and from there sail through the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. On the way they pass Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. They call it Dubai, Jeddah, or Suez. Chinese investments in East Africa are in reality investments in an entire system whose heart is the Middle East. That's why the Americans watch them with anxiety. That's why India tries to build alternatives. Every kilometer of tracks in Kenya, every bridge in Mozambique, every port in Uganda is a step toward a world in which trade flows through Chinese arteries. For the people of Africa, this is daily life, getting somewhere faster, moving goods more easily, linking a town with a port. For geopoliticians, it's a question: who will control this route in the future? Beijing, Washington, or someone else? Kenya, Uganda, and Mozambique show that the Belt and Road Initiative is not an abstract vision. It's concrete bridges, concrete trains, concrete loans, projects that link Africa with the Middle East and then with Europe. And the price, financial and political, is something these countries will be wrestling with for decades. That's why when we look at the port of Haifa or the Suez Canal, we must also remember Nairobi, Kampala, and Maputo. Because in this global puzzle, every bridge and every track matters. When we talk about West Africa, about Ghana, the first association is gold. Not by accident, Europeans called this region the Gold Coast for centuries. Portuguese, Dutch, British, everyone fought for access to the riches hidden in the red soil and tropical hills. Gold from Ghana decorated European crowns, financed expeditions and wars, and became a symbol of colonial plunder. Today, Ghana is an independent state, one of the more politically stable in the region. It has a dynamic economy, produces cocoa, extracts oil, develops tourism, but gold is still its greatest wealth and greatest curse. Wherever there is gold, there are those who want to grab it. In the last 2 decades, China entered Ghana, not as a colonial power with cannons and soldiers, but with loans, investments, and offers of friendship forever. Chinese companies began to take over mines, buy stakes in local firms, invest in infrastructure around goldfields. Sometimes this happened officially, sometimes semi-legally, through so-called galamsey, small-scale mining run by Chinese operators. For many Ghanaians, the Chinese became the face of a new colonialism. Our grandparents were exploited by Europeans. Now we are exploited by Asians, said one miner in an interview with a local newspaper. And indeed, images from the mines sometimes look like the 19th century. People working in mud with pickaxes and pans. Next to them, heavy equipment brought from China, operated by Chinese technicians. But there is another side to this. Chinese investments have helped make Ghana one of the largest gold exporters in the world. More than 130 tons of gold are mined there annually. It's an enormous volume that flows not only to Beijing, but also to Dubai, because Dubai has in recent years become the global center of gold trade. Officially, the Emirates have no mines, but warehouses in Dubai are filling up with tons of gold from Africa, from Ghana, Sudan, Congo. The gold flies into Dubai on planes, sometimes arrives on ships, often in containers that pass through the Red Sea. There it is refined, legalized, traded on exchanges, and then sent on to India, China, Europe. And this is exactly where West Africa connects with the Middle East. Gold from Ghana doesn't stay in Africa. It passes through Dubai, through the Emirates, through the very same Middle East that the Chinese are wrapping with their ports and roads. This way, Beijing gets a double benefit. It controls mines in Africa and at the same time cooperates with Dubai, which has become a hub in the gold trade. For Ghanaians, this reality is full of contradictions. On one hand, investments bring cash, new jobs, better infrastructure. On the other, local communities see environmental devastation, illegal mines, poisoned rivers. Anger toward the new colonizers is growing. The Ghanaian government is balancing. It needs export revenues, but also has to respond to protests. And again, just like in Kenya or Ethiopia, the issue of debt appears. Because Chinese investments are not only mines, they're also roads leading to ports, power plants supplying the mining industry, all financed by loans from Beijing. And loans need to be repaid in gold, land, political influence. Ghana's gold is not just a commodity, it's a currency in a global game. Some of it goes directly to China, some to Dubai. The Emirates have gained the status of a global hub where Asian and African interests intersect. In practice, it is the Middle East that becomes the node through which the wealth of West Africa flows. And here the question of the future returns. Will Ghana become the main beneficiary of its own gold? Or will it once again be a country that extracts raw materials while others get rich? Will Dubai and Beijing be the main winners and local communities the losers? Gold from Ghana is not just a story about Africa. It's also a story about the Middle East, about Dubai as the global gold marketplace, a story about China, which thanks to investments in Africa and cooperation with the Emirates, controls more and more of the global gold market. And finally, it's a story about how colonial patterns return in modern disguise. Ghana, Dubai, Beijing, 3 points on the map that together show how the Belt and Road really works. Not just railways and ports, but also gold. The oldest currency in the world, which has once again become a weapon in geopolitical rivalry. Africa has shown us the second face of the Belt and Road Initiative. Not the one from glossy brochures with modern ports and smiling politicians, but the one that truly changes people's lives on the streets of Nairobi, in Ghana's mines, or on the Bay of Maputo. Railways, bridges, and mines are not just investments here. They are weapons, currency, and promise. Chinese loans build trains in Ethiopia, bridges in Mozambique, and mines in Ghana, but at the same time, they make entire countries dependent on Beijing. For some, this is a path to modernization. For others, a new form of colonialism. But whatever the opinion, one fact is clear. Africa is moving ever deeper into China's orbit. And what does that have to do with the Middle East? Everything. Because goods from Addis Ababa, Nairobi, or Accra do not stay in Africa. They flow through ports on the Red Sea, through Dubai, through Suez. Gold from Ghana shines in Dubai, trains from Ethiopia end their run in Djibouti, oil from Sudan is pumped onto ships bound for Asia. The Middle East is becoming a natural node that connects African riches with global trade. And here lies the meaning of this story. Africa and the Middle East are the two lungs of the same Chinese strategy. One pumps resources and markets, the other reloads goods and controls sea routes. Together they form the bloodstream of the new Silk Road,